thankful for this place, this opportunity to learn more about your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Good evening. It is good to see you tonight. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. Our schedule has us tonight talking about the Tower of Babel incident as we make our way through Genesis and the beginning. And what I thought we would do is make some observations about that section and about the time frame and all of that. And then we'll read through the first 9 verses of Genesis chapter 11 to establish what we're talking about. And then from that point on, I have some things that we'll point out and some comments we can make, but I would like to let you have a say in it all. And so if there's something about this section that you want to comment on, I will give you the opportunity to do that instead of me doing all the talking about it, because it's a well-known section. Most folks are familiar with Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel and the things that go on there. But there's also some things about it that we kind of infer based on how God deals with it. So we can talk about that. First thing I want you to consider, I know this is kind of small, you may not be able to see it, but it's the timeline idea. And so it starts with Adam, and just what we're going to do is jump ahead, because you see Noah there on the screen, if you can see that. So when we jump ahead, you see that big yellow line, that's the flood. We talked about that for a couple of weeks. Kind of hard to see, isn't it? We see the flood there, that yellow line. So that's Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9, right along in there. And so that yellow line kind of is a marker. Date of that is not really what I'm after. I'm not really after what was the date of the flood. What I'm more interested in would be the generations that follow, because from those generations we then get quickly into Genesis chapters 11 and 12, and we start dealing with Abram or Abraham. Now, when you think about Abraham, you think about the beginning of the revealed solution to the problem. The problem was clearly identified back in Genesis chapter 3, but then we just went along for a while, and now beginning in Genesis 11 and 12, we began to see a solution to the problem. And so the date of that is interesting to us because, well, we can follow biblical history from Abraham. We can go through Isaac and Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob. We can take ourselves right through Old Testament history and timeline if we have a good feel for when Abram was on the earth and so on. So this is a kind of a big event, pictorial look at that very same timeline. You have the flood, then the Tower of Babel. While all of that's going on, you have some other things going on down below. You have Abraham, then Egyptian bondage, the Exodus, and so on and so forth. So when you think about Bible timeline, big picture-wise, in my mind at least, for whatever it's worth to you, in my mind, it starts really with Abraham. And we're introduced to Abraham and his family in Genesis 11 and 12. So that becomes the time from which we can calculate, if you will. We can go forward and understand those different generations. So to me, it's just kind of helpful to think of Genesis 11 and 12 that way. We're introduced in the latter part of Genesis chapter 11 to Abraham's family. That's why we're bringing it up here, because it is one of those markers on the timeline, and it's helpful for us to think about that. So the generations that flow out of Abraham, from around 21 BC-ish, and then go down to the time of the Exodus around 1445-ish BC. Then you go down to the time of the United Kingdom around 1000 BC-ish, 1040 BC, something like that. And then you get down to the divided kingdom around 726 BC. And then you have the Babylonian captivity business that begins about 605 BC. So Daniel and his friends are then taken in about 586 BC. So you can kind of go through that and work your way down as you work through the Old Testament. And the timeline works. And that's why it's a valuable thing to us, because whenever we're talking about an incident in the Old Testament, the first thing we need to know is, well, where's that on the timeline? Who are we talking about? Where do they fit in this story, in this narrative? Because the sooner we can place them in where they fit, the easier it is for us to understand them and remember them. I'll tell you one more time. The literal dates of all of those things are not really what matters to me. I wasn't there and I don't know the literal dates. It matters to me the sequence of events so I can have a way to remember and to hook these passages together and all of that. So just information for you as we begin Genesis 11 this evening. Now, a couple of things. I found these pictures years ago. They were interesting to me, that's all. Several depictions of the tower. I have no idea what it looked like. I mean, couldn't even begin to tell you what it looks like because there's no biblical description or evidence of what it looked like. But a lot of folks have said, hey, here's what it might have looked like. I have no idea. I just find that sort of thing interesting. It's interesting to me when someone says, watch this, I'm going to draw you a picture of something that I don't know what it looks like. That's just interesting to me. And so that's what we have. So I don't know, but I find it fascinating. So you can look at those. And now read with me in Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. Genesis 11 and verse 1. Remember, this is after Noah. This is after the flood. This is after the earth is beginning to be repopulated post-flood. So, Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used bricks for stone and they used tar for mortar. They said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Verse 5 says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. This story fits generally into the category of the story of creation, the story of the serpent in Genesis 3, the story of Jonah and the big fish. This fits into the category where folks look at this and go, no, there's no way. That's just not even possible. That can't be. It fits into the category of the story of the flood, where you're telling me that Noah, one guy, built a big ark, and then God did this, and then this happened. It is brought up often as an example of what could not be. And we've talked about that, how we look at things in the text that folks will look at and say, this could not be. And the best way to understand that from a believer's point of view is not to try to explain details that were not given. To me, that's futile. For me to try to tell you I know something that God didn't reveal doesn't make any sense, and so I'm not going to do that. What I will tell you is this. If you can get in your mind Genesis chapter 1, then Genesis chapter 11 is not a problem. And we have said that over and over again. I intend to continue saying that. If we can get in our minds Genesis 1, then Genesis 6 isn't a problem. It's just not an issue. And so once we understand that God spoke all of this into existence and He placed mankind here to reflect His image, to be image bearers of Him, and to rule over the earth, and then He began to deal with mankind as mankind did what they did. He began to interact with them. You see that immediately in Genesis 3. You see it again in Genesis 4. You see it again in Genesis 5. You see it again in Genesis 6, and so on. As God is doing that sort of thing, it would be no surprise to us here that we get a look from heaven's point of view at what people are doing. So when it says in verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built, what does that mean? Before we go into anything else, what does verse 5 mean? How would you say it today? And I'll call on you here in a minute now. So how would you say that today? Look at verse 5 and tell me how you would say that today. What does it mean?
He just took note of what was going on among the folks there.
He took note of what was going on among the folks there. Is it similar to what you see in the like Exodus chapters 3, 4, and 5, where the Lord saw His people in their suffering and the Lord remembered His people in the suffering? Does that mean in in Exodus that He forgot His people and all of a sudden remembered them? No, that's not what it means. It means He has taken note of them. He has seen them with a view to responding to what they're doing. And that's what you have here in verse 5. The Lord is looking at this situation now, and He is going to respond. He's going to deal with this situation. It is not that He was somewhere else, unaware of what was happening on the plain of Shinar, and all of a sudden happened by and was surprised. That's not it at all. What we have here is a statement saying God has taken note of this and is going to respond to this somehow. And that gets our attention. God's going to respond to it. And so then you have in verse 6 and 7 essentially the same thing you have in Genesis 1, verse 26, where God is speaking to God, right? And what we have is a view of the divine logic, the divine reasoning. God is there classified in verse 7 as an us, right? A plural, just like Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image. And so God is speaking to God. God is reasoning within Himself, we might say. And we get that because sometimes we say to ourselves, right? That's what we're after here. And so God has said to God, okay, I have taken note of what they're doing, I see what they're doing, and the reasonable thing for me to do, the logical thing for me to do, the divine thing for me to do is to respond to this. And so the response of God is to acknowledge they're one people with one language, and this is what they're doing now. And so then the logic is, stated in verse 6, now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. What does that mean? How would you describe that? That's how God is reasoning about them. What does that mean?
If they will do this, what will stop them? You know, He gave them a chance to kind of change somebody who reasoned that we don't do this, and that wasn't happening. All of them thought the same thing.
Okay. All of them are going in one direction. Now, if that one direction is a good direction, is that a problem? So at this point, we can now back up and say, okay, what's the problem? Why do we have an issue here? The divine, the Creator, looks at them and says, I've taken note of you, I'm going to respond to you, and here's why I'm going to respond to you. Because you're all speaking the same language and working together for the same purpose. Well, why is that a bad thing? Well, we need to go back and see what they were doing to understand why God has this view of them. So let's back up and let's look at what they were doing. It says that they journeyed east. Now, most folks would look at this section and see how chapter 10 flows out, the descendants of Noah, and they would say, okay, Noah and his families, they repopulate the earth, have gone in this, they've headed east. Some of them at least have headed east. A big bunch of them have headed east. This is what they're doing. So verse 4, after having learned to make bricks, and they figured out some things, after having done all of this, they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. So verse 4 is the reason why verse 5, why God takes note of them. So what's the problem with verse 4? What is it that they're doing that causes God to say, I'm going to intervene here?
Let us. It was
Okay.
a total me,
Okay.
not reconcile.
All right. What is their focus? Is there Yeah, they're wanting to do what they want to do, and from a creator's standpoint, what would be a better option? From the Creator's standpoint, what would be a better attitude to have as you repopulate the earth and go out into God's earth? What's a better attitude to have other than let us make a name for ourselves, let us do what we want to do, let us be awesome? What's a better attitude to have? Yeah, let's focus on what God would have us to do. How ought we honor the Creator of the earth we're now on? How should we respond to the Creator of the earth we're on? What is it that we collectively, given that we have tremendous capability as we speak the same language and work together, what is it that we ought to be doing to honor and revere the God who put us here, the God who made us, the God who saved us or brought us back from Adam and his family? Because you know these folks were aware of what took place. So their view is not a God-honoring view, and the point we need to understand is it ought to be a God-honoring view in view of the fact of the flood. These are folks who came out of the 8 souls who were saved. That's the significance of chapter 10. Chapter 10 is now, these are the records of the generations of the sons of Noah. These people came out of the survivors. And so logic would dictate that they live in view of the one who allowed them to survive. That they turn their attention, like their ancestor Noah did, that they turn their attention to God and began to honor God, began to seek God, began to say, what is it that we should do in view of God preserving life on earth? I don't know what all Noah and his kids told their descendants. I really don't. When you read through chapter 10, you have the generational kind of statement, but what you see in verse 5 of chapter 10 is from these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. There's a large group of folks that speak the same language that are headed east. I have a hard time believing they were unaware of what took place with Noah and his family, because they come from Noah and his family. And so since there is this heritage, if we can use that term, since there is this lineage, this not too distant relative of ours who went through all of this, since there is that, it would make sense that we live in view of that. But when we get to chapter 11, we're not living in view of that. We're not interested in that. We're interested in doing our own thing. And the statement is telling in verse 4, making a name for ourselves. We're interested in elevating self instead of elevating God. I think if we leave the flood, the recent history of mankind, out of this story, we miss part of the story. When we include the flood in the story, we understand why it is so compelling for God to respond to them. It is not that there were a few people who were ignoring who He is. It is that there were a whole bunch of people who were saved by Noah and his sons and God and the ark through the flood, and they have quickly forgotten the significance of who God is. And they have become me people. It's all about me. So with that, I just want to ask you, before we move on to some other things, is it so that in our time today, there ought to be something passed down to the next generation about God and about the significance of God and about the goodness and greatness of God and all of that? Ought we to do that? Do we have anything that would cause us to be passionate about that? Is there anything that God has done for us? Think of Noah and his sons in the flood. Is there anything God has done for us personally that would cause us to be passionate about spreading the news about Him to our descendants? That would cause us to be serious about that and compelled to do it? Is there anything God has done for us that would cause us to have that attitude? Okay, the giving of His Son on the cross. For whom? For us. Yeah. When we personalize that, it is literally for each individual. When we personalize that, the sacrifice God has made, the price He paid for us, it becomes a very real thing to us. And it becomes something that we cannot ignore, even that we cannot fail to emphasize to our descendants. Our responsibility is to tell about Him. Their responsibility is to listen and then to tell about Him. But let's forget about for a moment their responsibility and talk about our responsibility. As you see these people here back in Genesis 11, living their own lives, doing their own thing, pursuing their own business, elevating themselves, you see God responding to that and saying, that's not good. That's not good. And so then we can say, okay, I can apply that to my own life and say, I need to, in view of what God's done for me, like what God did for Noah, I need to tell my descendants and those around me and the lineage, whatever it is that I leave, I need to tell them about God, the goodness of God, the greatness of God, and all of that. Because I'm obligated to do that because of what He's done for me. If I do not, then my life becomes all about what I want and not about who He is and what He requires. You have any comment about that? Anything you want to say about that? Yes, ma'am.
In 10, where everybody in their own lands, nations, had their own language, how is that if everybody was speaking the same language?
Yeah, great question. There's two ways folks look at that, and I'll let you decide which one is the most reasonable resolution to the question, because it is a valid question. The way most versions read in verse 5 of chapter 10 is, and let me just read the New American Standard, most reflect it this way. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to the families, into their nations. Okay, that is a statement about the spreading of people to other places. And so the first thing folks will say about that is verse 5 of chapter 10 is codifying or marking or commenting on or telling us about what God did in chapter 11. So what it is saying this is the way mankind spread out. Does that make sense? That's I would say, the most popular way of reconciling 10:5 with 11:4, or really 11:8, really. So, number one. Number two is the people we see here in 11 are not every single person who is alive. It is a whole bunch of folks that moved east, and there is a mass of them, not the whole of the population. The problem I have with that understanding of it is verse 1 of chapter 11. I have a little bit of an issue with that understanding of it. And so the way I tend to reconcile 10:5 with chapter 11 is chapter 10 is telling us the big picture of how it all went. Now, chapter 11 is giving us the specific of what God did to make all of that happen. If you want another example of how Exodus does that sort of thing, you can look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In Genesis chapter 1, Adam and Eve are created in the image of God, yes? In Genesis chapter 2, Adam and Eve are created in the image of God again, yes? Well, yes and no. We have an account, a spread out, detailed account of the creation of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2. We have a little statement about it in chapter 1, a bigger statement about it in chapter 2. It already happened in chapter 1, but in chapter 2 we have more detail about it. To me, that's kind of what you see with Genesis 10 and 11 and the spreading of the people and the languages. That's the best I know to do with it anyway. If someone has a better idea or reconciliation or understanding of it, I'm open to that. That's the best one I've dealt with. A good question, though, because to me, when you're just reading through the narrative, wait, this already happened. And that's the same thing you run into in Genesis 2. What you say in Genesis 2 is, wait, this already happened. We already created Adam and Eve. Yes, but now we're getting a more detailed explanation of that specific instance. Does that help? Okay. Anything else about this? Yes, ma'am.
Amplified in verse 6, it says, it's the only beginning of what they will do in rebellion against me.
Yeah.
And now no evil thing they imagine they can do will be impossible.
Thank you for that.
It's very fascinating that the expectation is we all have the same language. We can come up with any kind of evil, and our words use that. So he said, if I can keep you from coming together in the same language, it's kind of tamper the evil that's already been done.
It's a really, really good comment. Let me ask you this. What is it that has happened in the last 15 or 20 years that kind of, in a sense, gives us all the same language? The internet? Yeah. And has some negative things come from that? Possibly? Maybe? Potentially? Yeah, there is a principle that says the more of us that can gang up, the worse we can do. We say from time to time that people are nice, mobs are crazy. You know, it's the same people. It really is the very same people. But when they become that, they become much more volatile. That's kind of what I think of when I read through this section, that we're now dealing with a group of people who are unlimited in their potential to do whatever they want to do, however they want to do it. And that's the issue God seems to have with it. That seems to be the reason why we're saying, okay, God is looking at this and going, oh, I'm going to make an adjustment here. It is not that He's taken off guard by it or caught off guard or taken aback. It is simply that He is saying, this is how the story unfolds. And when we got to this point, this is how I dealt with that. Part of the challenge for us, even today, even with all of the information we have about God and what He has done and how He has related to humanity, part of the challenge is trying to see things from His perspective, from the divine perspective. And even when we can do that, like here, we can read verses 6 and 7 and then the result in verse 8, and we can see divine reasoning. But even when we see snippets of divine reasoning, we still struggle putting that into context and understanding what that really means. Let me give you another example of that we talked about not too awful long ago, and that is in Job chapters 1 and 2. There was a day when the sons of God presented themselves before God, and Satan came also. Remember last time we talked about that? And we talked about how God said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And so many people view that as God setting Job up to be tempted, to be dealt with by Satan. It's almost as if, and some folks even say it this way, that God just kind of offered Job up for Satan to do his worst, to see how it would go. And I do not believe that is so. I just flat out do not believe that is the divine logic and reasoning applied. What I believe with all my heart is happening there is Satan is already going about to and fro on the earth, tempting and dealing with. He's already intending to tempt Job. He's already dealing with him. And God brings him up to make his point, to make the divine's point. But because we see a little bit, we sometimes extrapolate into, well, this is how we reason. This is what we would do in that circumstance. Therefore, that must be what God is doing. Because I got a little look behind the curtain at God's reasoning. Now I extrapolate that into how I would reason or how mankind would reason. And it doesn't work that way. And I think that's a bit of the struggle we have with Genesis chapter 11 when God says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go down there and I'm going to confuse the language so that they will not understand one another's speech. Because sometimes we look at that and go, well, that was a temporary solution, wasn't it? I mean, really and truly. Now you've got this thing on your phone that, translates all sorts of different languages. That's a temporary solution, right? Did God not know that was a temporary solution? That's how we tend to think. What we need to understand is we're not the divine, and so much of what God is doing, He is doing for a specific reason, for a period of time, for some reason beyond my awareness. May or may not be beyond my comprehension. It's just not my awareness. It's not my knowledge because it's not my business. So when we read through these stories like this, we need to understand that if we're good with Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God, if we're good with that, then we're good with Genesis 11. We get that. And then we understand that the divine reasoning is never fully explained. What I mean by that is we're never going to be in a circumstance where we fully understand from beginning to end God's logic and reasoning on anything. Is that fair to say? We understand about His plan of salvation. We call it the scheme of redemption, all kinds of ways we describe it. We understand about it. What we understand about it is the best we can based on what He has revealed. Do you think there are other things going on in the world regarding salvation from heaven's point of view of which we're not privy? Is God doing something that I don't know about? Let me ask it that way. I would say odds are good. God is doing something I'm not aware of. He doesn't owe us detailed explanations about how things go. And that's fine. The problem for us is when He does give us a little bit of information about the logic and the mindset and the approach, then sometimes we act as if that's all there is, and now we can critique it. And shame on us for that. Part of their problem is their absolute arrogance. Part of their problem is their refusal to factor God into their day, into their lives. And it is especially a problem for them in view of what their recent ancestors had endured and survived. And I would suggest for us that it is the very same thing. It just is exactly the same thing for us. Most of us have people close to us who have survived, if you will, dealing with Satan and the temptations. They've overcome. They've lived life in a way that allows them to overcome. And they've gone on to the reward promised. And as we look at all of that, we need to be inspired by that to remember who God is and not live our lives in view of self. Not live our lives with an attitude that says, I'm going to make a name for myself. Watch this. What if we all at the same time said, we want to honor God's name. And we want, to the very best of our ability, teach our descendants to honor God's name. Will it work in 100% of the time? Probably not. It never has. Is it the thing we ought to do in view of what God's done for us? Absolutely it is. So this story is really helpful for us. Before we have a couple of minutes, before we wrap up, chapter 11, verse 10 through 32 gets into the descendants of Shem, which lead us to Abraham and his family. And one of the things that's interesting about them, you see verse 24 of that chapter, one of the interesting things about that is Abram's family became what? It starts with an I, then the next letter is a D, and it goes on from there. What did Abraham's family, what were they described as in the text? Idolaters, yeah. It's a very interesting thing. And so right off the bat, we understand that the longer time goes, the further we can, if we so choose, get away from God and His things. Given more time, we run the risk of getting further and further away from Him. We see that happen here. What we also see is a God who says, I'm here to help. And so even though we find out in Joshua chapter 24 that Terah, Abraham's father, was an idolater, we see God dealing with Abraham to bring about the Israelites through whom will bring about the Christ. Here's what I want to leave you with. Don't think we read one section and get a complete picture of who God is and what God's doing. It just does not work that way. Our pursuit of Him is on every page of the Bible. Our understanding of Him grows on every single page of the text. And when we read through something like this and we see God's logic, we see God responding to something, don't turn a critical eye on it and say, well, I don't think you should have done it like that, and that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see why I would do that. Don't do that. Don't waste your time doing all of that. It's disrespectful to who God is. Look at it and say, I'm going to put this in the bank of knowledge I have about who He is and how He responds. Because what you'll end up with, ultimately, is an understanding of God's patience, of God's mercy, of God's love, of God's compassion. Now, you will see His wrath sprinkled in there. There's no question about that. But what you really will get is God loves you, and God wants to help you. That's who He is. And so our service to Him then should just flow automatically because of who He is. Anything else before we wrap up this section? Lord willing, next Wednesday evening we will begin with the promise made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, I think. Thank you so much.